Washington, September 1939. News of Germany's invasion of Poland crosses the Atlantic faster than the wind that carries the smoke of burning cities. Inside the White House, the sound of ticking clocks mixes with the hum of typewriters in the Treasury Department. America watches Europe collapse once again, but this time, the president refuses to let history repeat itself. Franklin D. Roosevelt studies a map covered in red pins. He knows that if the United States enters the war too early, it will bleed as it did in 1917. Yet if it stands aside, the world may drown in dictatorship. Between those two fates lies a narrow corridor, built not with soldiers, but with money. Outside, the Great Depression still lingers like fog. 17 million Americans are unemployed, and half the nation's factories stand silent. Industrial production remains 20% below its level before the crash of 1929. In the shipyards of New Jersey and the steel mills of Pittsburgh, rust has become a national color. Roosevelt understands that idleness can be deadlier than war. The same machines that once built cars could forge aircraft engines. The same steel that lies cold in warehouses could roar back to life if someone, somewhere, had the gold to buy it. In Berlin, laughter fills the propaganda offices. To them, America is a merchant nation, too soft to fight, too greedy to take sides. But Roosevelt sees opportunity in that greed. What if neutrality could pay? What if the United States could stay innocent on paper, while every crate of bullets it sold whispered a silent allegiance? That night, thunder breaks over the Potomac as Roosevelt drafts the first outlines of a plan. It will not send troops, only cargo. The formula is deceptively simple. Sell weapons, demand cash, let foreign ships carry the risk. No loans, no credit, no American blood, just business. As the printing presses of Wall Street hum again, the economy stirs. Somewhere in Europe, bombs fall. Somewhere in America, dollars rise. A paradox is born, a nation claiming neutrality while quietly fueling the fires of war with its currency. Roosevelt looks at the first reports on his desk and wonders, can a democracy defend itself, not with soldiers, but with sails? The proposal reached Congress in the uncertain light of September 1939. Europe was on fire, but Washington still argued about whether to sell a match. Roosevelt's request to amend the Neutrality Act sounded to many like the whisper of a salesman rather than the voice of a leader. Senators rose one after another to accuse him of preparing to drag the nation into another foreign bloodbath. Isolation was the new religion, and the memories of trenches and wooden crosses still haunted the American heart. Across the ocean, the response was even harsher. In Berlin, the propaganda ministry ridiculed Roosevelt's money for murder plan. Newspapers called the United States a nation of shopkeepers, hiding behind oceans while pretending to choose moral sides. Italian commentators sneered that the Americans would rather count coins than casualties. In Tokyo, officials observed with cool amusement that Americans would sell anything, as long as someone else carried it. The laughter was not just mockery, it was a form of blindness. They saw a marketplace, not a weapon. Inside the United States, Wall Street analysts were divided. Some whispered that the plan might ignite production again, but most feared chaos. Ships sunk, debts unpaid, reputations ruined. Editors mocked the phrase cash and carry, comparing it to a grocery slogan unworthy of a great power. The British ambassador tried to reassure Roosevelt that his courage was not wasted, but even London doubted that Congress would approve. The debates dragged on through autumn. Isolationist senators filled the air with warnings. Once we sell a rifle, we will have to defend it with our own sons. Roosevelt listened, silent, knowing that every hour lost in argument cost Europe another city. On the final day of voting, the galleries were packed, reporters ready to record either the death or the birth of a policy. When the count was read, 243 in favor, 181 opposed, the chamber fell into a heavy, uncertain quiet. Roosevelt had won, but only barely. Outside, rain streaked the Capitol's marble steps. The world was still laughing, unaware that a door had just opened. The president had not yet sent a single soldier to war, but his pen had armed the first wave of an invisible army, the army of the dollar. The idea behind cash and carry was not born from greed, but from memory. The First World War had left a scar that still throbbed beneath the surface of the American economy. After 1917, the United States had lent billions to Europe. By the time the guns fell silent, most of those debts had turned to dust. Nations defaulted, currencies collapsed, and faith in foreign promises died. Roosevelt learned from that catastrophe. Lending to a burning continent ends in ashes. By the late 1930s, isolationism had become not only political but psychological. A financial trauma turned into law. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 36, and 37 sealed the country like a vault. They forbade the sale of arms to any belligerent, banned loans, and kept American ships out of danger zones. The United States had become an island of conscience, safe but stagnant. Roosevelt knew that without motion, even virtue would decay. So, he searched for a loophole that could turn moral paralysis into strategic advantage. The answer came from his Treasury and State Department advisors: cash up front, transport at buyer's risk. No loans, no American ships, no exposure to submarines. The risk would sail away with the buyer. The profit would stay in American vaults. The simplicity of the idea hid its brilliance. Whoever controlled the cash would control the course of the war. By 1939, the Atlantic economy had frozen. Britain and France were armed with weapons from a previous generation, their treasuries draining by the hour. Germany, living off the spoils of conquest, had energy and iron, but little hard currency. Across the ocean, the United States sat on a mountain of wealth, over 20,000 tons of gold, nearly 70% of the world's reserves. Neutrality, in practice, already favored the side that could afford peace. Cash and carry would make that favoritism official. The law could not name allies or enemies, but geography had already done so. Only Britain and France had the fleets to reach American ports safely. Only they had the gold to pay. For Roosevelt, this was not charity. It was design. In a single stroke, he redefined neutrality itself. America would remain untouched by the fighting, yet its currency would travel ahead of every army. The factories of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Buffalo would hum again, not for ideology, but for opportunity. Dollars would cross the ocean, as soldiers once had. And in that exchange, Roosevelt discovered something no general had ever possessed: the power to wage war through the arithmetic of survival. When Roosevelt signed the amended Neutrality Act in November 1939, celebration was brief. The law existed, but its power was still theoretical. Shipyards remained quiet, and warehouses stayed full. Merchants hesitated, afraid that cash and carry was nothing more than a clever phrase. Belief, like investment, takes time to mature. In Boston and New York, shipping companies examined the fine print. Buyers had to pay in full, in gold or US dollars, and transport their own cargo on non-American ships. Insurance brokers refused coverage, fearing German submarines. Dock workers idled beside empty piers. For a moment, the new law looked like a masterpiece without an audience. Roosevelt's critics mocked him again. The president's gamble, they called it. Newspapers joked that he was trying to sell guns by the pound and prayers by the crate. Even allies in Congress whispered that no sane nation would risk sending ships across an ocean ruled by the Reich. Yet Roosevelt trusted in a different logic, the desperation of those already fighting for survival. That desperation arrived in December. British agents led by the newly formed British Purchasing Commission appeared in New York with letters of credit backed by gold. The first orders were modest: 10,000 rifles, 500 training aircraft, and spare engines worth $50 million. Within weeks, new contracts followed. By the end of the year, Allied orders totaled $650 million, filling factories that had stood silent since the Depression. In the Midwest, furnaces reignited, sparks returned to the forges, and night shifts replaced breadlines. Men who had not worked in years now built machines that would cross the sea to defend a world they might never see. America's industrial heart began to beat again. For Roosevelt, these numbers were not merely statistics. They were proof that his idea worked. The experiment had turned into movement. Neutrality, once a wall, was becoming a weapon. Yet, as the ships left harbor, he sensed the shadow behind success. The more money moved across the ocean, the closer America itself drifted toward the storm. By the first months of 1940, the Atlantic had become a floating marketplace of survival, From Liverpool to Le Havre, the Allies searched the seas for ships flying neutral flags and carrying crates stamped "Made in USA." British freighters, stripped of emblems and painted gray, loaded weapons in the fog of New York Harbor and vanished into the ocean night. They were escorted not by American destroyers, but by a currency strong enough to protect them, the dollar. Inside Manhattan's financial district, the British Purchasing Commission under Sir Arthur Purvis turned offices at 15 Broad Street into a fortress of paperwork. Telegrams streamed between London and New York, ordering everything from trucks to torpedoes. Each day, bankers and military officers signed contracts measured not in words but in weight. Tons of steel, barrels of oil, millions of bullets. Within 8 months, over $1 billion worth of war goods had been purchased, including 2,000 aircraft, 600 million rounds of ammunition, and 300,000 tons of steel. Across the American landscape, production roared to life. California assembled bombers under new hangars. Illinois poured molten metal into shell casings. The South built trucks that would cross deserts. And New England wired radios that would whisper across the channel. The rhythm of industry drowned out the memory of hunger. By the end of 1940, exports to Allied nations had risen more than 70%, and unemployment had fallen by nearly a third. Observers in Berlin began to take notice. Reports described a silent mobilization inside the United States, one that defied the definitions of neutrality. German officials initially mocked the system, calling it warfare for hire, but as Allied stockpiles filled with American weapons, the tone shifted from laughter to alarm. Germany's economy, confined by blockades, could not compete with the limitless energy of American production, fueled by cash and gold. For Roosevelt, the transformation was both economic and moral. Cash and carry had proven that neutrality could serve justice. America had found a way to oppose tyranny without breaking its own laws. The United States was not fighting with rifles, but with receipts, not through conquest, but through capacity. Every ship leaving its harbor carried a piece of American conviction, the belief that freedom could be financed, and that democracy, when armed with purpose and production, could defend itself. By the summer of 1940, the truth was undeniable. The world's largest arsenal belonged to a nation still officially at peace. And on the ledgers of war, the first victories were written not in blood, but in balance. The old world measured power in guns and battalions. Roosevelt measured it in production schedules and purchasing orders. He understood that the shape of modern war was shifting, from trenches to trade routes, from soldiers to suppliers. The cash and carry system had quietly replaced generals with accountants, and battlefields with balance sheets. In Washington, this transformation was both revolutionary and unsettling. The State Department now functioned like a brokerage house, the Treasury like a war office. Every shipment approved, every ton of steel exported, was an act of strategy disguised as commerce. The language of neutrality still framed the headlines, but behind closed doors, officials were learning a new dialect, the grammar of economic warfare. Roosevelt's insight was simple, yet subversive. If wars were fought over resources, then control of global resources could end a war before it began. He did not need to defeat the Axis armies. He needed to outlast their economies. Every nation has a breaking point, and his task was to reach Germany's wallet before Germany reached Britain's shores. Across the Atlantic, Allied commanders began to speak of American contracts as if they were reinforcements. A new squadron of bombers was not just a delivery, it was a declaration. Cash and carry was proving that neutrality could bleed the aggressor dry without firing a shot. For American industry, this new warfare meant resurrection. Car plants turned into aircraft lines. Shipyards learned to forge liberty instead of leisure. The labor force grew patriotic, not through slogans, but through paychecks. A welder's spark in Detroit now had the weight of a rifle shot in France. Yet beneath the surface, there was unease. How long could a nation profit from a war without being pulled into it? The more the factories thrived, the thinner the veil of neutrality became. Roosevelt saw it coming, the day when finance would no longer be enough, when ideals would demand arms. But for the moment, he had achieved the impossible. He had reinvented warfare itself. Victory was no longer measured by territory captured, but by production sustained. And as Europe burned, America was proving that the most decisive weapon of the 20th century might not be the bomb or the tank, but the economic mine that built them. By the middle of 1940, the American economy had become an organism made of steel, electricity, and urgency. Cities once silenced by the Depression now pulsed through the night. Freight trains rattled over iron bridges carrying aluminum, engines, and ammunition. America's factories no longer produced goods for consumption, they produced momentum. Detroit, Buffalo, and Seattle expanded into landscapes of endless assembly lines. Men who had once stood idle now earned more than ever before. Between 1939 and 1941, unemployment fell from 17% to below 10%. Industrial output surged by 50% in 2 years, the fastest expansion in modern history. What had begun as Roosevelt's economic gamble was now the world's most efficient machine. Foreign journalists visiting the Midwest spoke of miles of conveyor belts moving wings, fuselages, and tanks in synchronized rhythm. To them, it looked less like industry and more like choreography, a nation dancing to the drumbeat of destiny. In those same months, exports to the Allies surpassed every previous record. The United States was still officially neutral, yet no one doubted which side its factories served. Germany's intelligence officers reported the phenomenon with disbelief. Their economists warned that American production would soon dwarf the entire Axis industrial base combined. The Reich could seize territory, but it could not seize productivity. Berlin's propaganda, once mocking, grew defensive. They had underestimated a weapon they could not bomb or blockade. In Washington, Roosevelt studied the charts like a general examining maps of an invisible front. Each rise in factory output meant more planes in British skies, more tanks in French fields. Without a single division deployed, the United States was altering the balance of power. Cash and carry had turned the nation's economy into a silent ally, a factory front spanning an entire continent. By the end of 1940, America was producing over half the world's manufactured goods. Its power was no longer measured in soldiers or ships, but in capacity. The dollar had become the bloodstream of the Allied war effort, and its pulse could be heard in every hammer strike, every engine roar, every bill of sale. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a metaphor, it was a heartbeat. Every miracle carries a debt. As American industry thundered back to life, someone else's vaults fell silent. In London, the Bank of England's gold reserves, once among the richest in the world, began to vanish. Shipments of treasure, guarded by armed sailors, left British ports under the codename Operation Fish. It was the largest transfer of wealth in human history. More than 2,000 tons of gold, nearly 200 million pounds sterling, enough to fill 5,000 crates. Their destination was Canada, safe, neutral, and close to the American markets where that gold would soon be spent. The voyage was perilous. U-boats prowled the Atlantic, hunting for the convoys that carried not weapons, but the financial lifeblood of the British Empire. Only a few in Churchill's cabinet knew the scale of the risk. If the gold were lost, Britain would be bankrupt overnight. Yet desperation outweighed danger. By the time the last shipment arrived in Ottawa's underground vaults, Britain had secured the means to continue buying American arms, but at a staggering cost. For Roosevelt, the reports were both vindication and warning. The system worked. The Allies were armed, American factories were alive, and the dollar was rising as the only stable currency left. But the more successful cash and carry became, the more it drained the Allies of independence. Every new contract tightened the invisible bond between London and Washington. Britain's strength was being rebuilt with borrowed confidence. On the American side, workers saw only prosperity. Employment soared, wages climbed, and the lights of industry burned all night. Few questioned what fueled the revival. Behind every paycheck lay a transaction paid in foreign gold and risked across foreign waters. In Berlin, German economists observed the same pattern with alarm. They recognized that while the Axis still dominated territory, it was losing the economic war. Germany could capture cities, but not liquidity. It could print marks, but not manufacture dollars. By the end of 1940, Britain's gold reserves were nearly exhausted. The miracle of recovery had a hidden cost, the financial sovereignty of an empire. Cash and carry had saved the Allies from defeat, but it also bound them to a new power. The age of empire was ending, and the age of dependency, anchored by the dollar, had quietly begun. By early 1941, the arithmetic of survival had changed. Britain's gold was gone, and the cash and carry system had reached its natural limit. Roosevelt understood that demanding cash from a bankrupt ally was no longer strategy. It was suicide. So, he proposed something audacious. Lend today, collect after victory. The idea became the Lend-Lease Act, a law that replaced gold with faith and payment with promise. The act passed in March 1941. Overnight, the American role in the war transformed. No longer a neutral supplier, the United States became the financial backbone of the Allied resistance. Destroyers for bases had already hinted at this evolution a year earlier. 50 U.S. warships exchanged for British naval bases across the Atlantic. Lend-Lease expanded it to a global scale. By 1945, over $50 billion worth of weapons, vehicles, and supplies had been shipped abroad, an amount greater than the entire Axis gold reserves combined. This flood of material altered the shape of the war. Britain, the Soviet Union, and China all fought with American steel. Liberty ships crossed oceans faster than German U-boats could sink them. The arsenal that cash and carry had awakened now reached full maturity. Factories that once built for cash now produced for credit. And the credit was America's faith in its own future. When the Allies met at Bretton Woods in 1944, that faith became structure. The dollar was fixed to gold, and every other currency was fixed to the dollar. It was not a treaty of occupation, but of orientation. The world would now revolve around a single financial axis, Washington. For Europe, reconstruction would soon depend on the same system. The Marshall Plan followed, pouring billions more into a continent reduced to rubble. The old empires of Britain and France had financed their wars with colonial tribute. Now they financed recovery with American loans. The United States had built an empire without conquest, an empire of credit, measured not by territory but by trust. Historians still debate Roosevelt's intentions. Was it generosity or dominance? Perhaps both. But one truth stands beyond argument. The dollar had outlived every weapon. Cash and carry was only the opening act in a century where money would command armies, redraw borders, and rule peace itself. Spring 1945. Washington is quiet beneath a sky of victory and absence. Roosevelt is gone, dead only weeks before the war's end, but his shadow still moves across the marble corridors. He had left behind not a military empire, but a financial one, a nation whose power was measured in currency rather than conquest. The United States emerged from the war untouched by ruin. Its factories were intact, its people employed, its coffers overflowing. Half of the world's total production now came from American industry. 2/3 of the planet's gold rested in American vaults. The dollar, once a tool of commerce, had become the bloodstream of the global economy. Across the Atlantic, the contrast was stark. Britain was deep in debt. France struggled to rebuild. Germany lay in ruins. Yet each turned to Washington, not for soldiers this time, but for solvency. Loans, credits, and reconstruction plans flowed outward like lifelines. What began as cash and carry had become the economic architecture of the post-war world. The transformation was almost invisible, yet absolute. The United States did not need colonies. It had creditors. It did not raise armies to occupy. It raised interest rates to control. The battlefield had shifted from land to ledgers, from tanks to trust. Every post-war treaty and trade agreement carried Roosevelt's invisible signature, the belief that stability could be purchased and peace could be priced. The irony was profound. A policy born from fear of another world war had ensured that every future conflict would be fought under the shadow of the dollar. Power no longer marched in uniform. It was printed, invested, and exchanged. The story of cash and carry ends where modern history begins, with money replacing the gun. The dollar had conquered without firing a shot, rewriting what victory meant in the 20th century. If you are still listening, tell us which story of wartime finance you want us to uncover next. Thank you.